This is a conversation about credit versus debit as you are preparing yourself to pass the National Real Estate Exam. Let's sidetrack a little bit. The topic of financing presents certain disclosures that the buyer needs to receive. One of them is a closing disclosure that is supposed to be received and signed by the borrower 3 business days prior to closing. It is going to be reviewed, and in it is where we're going to see some of the things that we're going to talk about in this particular video. You're seeing there are 2 major columns: borrower paid. When was it paid? At closing or before closing? And then on the seller side, same thing. Seller paid. Was it paid at closing or before closing? This is going to be a snapshot and conversation of what is a credit, what is a debit, and is there any prorations. The time is important. In terms of time, when you are getting questions about closing and debits, this is what I want you to remember the most. Focus on that day. This is a snapshot of that day. What day are we referring to? The closing or the settlement date, that final date when buyers receiving the keys and sellers receiving the money that was promised. This is a snapshot of that day. Let's focus on that day. Transactions up to this final day, up to this closing date or settlement date, whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. Who owes this money? Is it the buyer or the seller? Who's receiving the money? Is it the buyer or the seller? Once again, echoing it again, focus on that day of settlement or closing. So what is a credit? A credit is going to be money that has already been paid. Again, who has paid for it will depend on the question, but credit, money already paid. That is why it's a credit, because somebody's receiving this money. It has already been paid. So now I am receiving it because I've already paid for it. Or sometimes it's not the entire bill that I'm getting. Sometimes I'm getting some of that money back because it has been prorated. Either way, someone is receiving that money, whether it's the buyer or the seller. This is money that has already been paid. Someone is receiving that money. Well, here you go. Some examples of credits to the buyer. The earnest money deposit. You're hoping, dear buyer, that you're getting the entire thing. Why? You did what you were supposed to do, and therefore whatever money you put at the beginning of this conversation or when the offer was accepted, if there's any deposit collected, then buyer, this is a credit back to you, the buyer. Security deposit paid by the tenant. What does that mean? Dear buyer, you're buying a property that is occupied. There's a tenant. The tenant already gave the seller the security deposit. You're buying the property with the tenant. If there's a lease in place, that's going to continue even past settlement. Therefore, the seller is going to be giving you that security deposit. So that's a credit. Dear buyer, you're receiving it. So that when the lease is over, you are going to be able to give it to the tenant. Dear buyer, the funds that are used to purchase that property are credits to you. And sometimes you might have negotiated for the seller to help you with some of the closing cost. If that is the case, then that is a credit to you, dear buyer. How about on the seller side? Seller, my friend, you might have already paid for the property taxes up front. So now the jurisdiction is not going to change that due date for that property taxes, are they? Just because you sold the house. No. So whatever you paid, if you paid for the entire time, then you're going to be receiving some of the money back for what you will not have used because you will have sold the property. Buyer promised to buy the property for a certain price. So seller, my friend, the selling price is a credit to you. Seller, you might have already paid for the homeowners association, the condo fees, or any assessment fees up front. Therefore, depending on how that bill is paid, you're going to be receiving credit, seller, my friend, on that day of closing. So what has not been used. Debit. This is a debt. Debit. This is a debt. Both start with the letter D, so maybe it's going to be helpful for you to remember that it's a debt. This is money owed on that day of closing. This is a charge. Somebody's going to pay for it on that day of closing. Debit, debt, money owed, it's a charge. What are some examples of debits, either to the buyer or to the seller, my dear? Some of you are exposed to accounting. This doesn't work how you've been taught in accounting, where if it's a debit on this side, hey, it has to be a credit on this side. No, this is just who owes the money. That is a debt, debit to that person. Who is receiving it? That is a credit to that individual. So examples of debits would be the existing mortgage to be paid. Seller, my friend, might have a mortgage, and whatever balance is left, that is due. So that's a debit to the seller. If the attorney is involved, who's paying for that? If there's any loan origination fees or the lender has charged some fees, most likely that's the buyer. So that is a debit, a debt to be paid. Compensation to the agents, who's responsible for that. Title or escrow company fees. If it's being split, then it's a debit to the buyer and debit to the seller. Who's responsible to pay this bill? Recording cost to that jurisdiction or state. Home warranty. Who's going to be buying it? If the seller offered it as an incentive to the buyer to purchase the property, then it's a seller. It's a debit to the seller. If the buyer elected to buy it, then this would be a debit to the buyer who owes that money. Prorations. We talked a little bit or introduced it a little bit, so let's review what is prorations or what is a proration. Prorated things. This is where it is distributed fairly between the buyer and the seller. So this is where we're going to look at whatever bill it is, and then we're going to make sure that it is distributed fairly in terms of to allocate what has been used and not already used. Somebody is receiving a reimbursement for what has not been used. Let's show an example here. Property taxes, let's say were paid in July and they were paid for the entire year. If settlement is happening in September, then seller has used July, August, and September. So seller is going to be reimbursed from October through next year, June the 30th. So that is what we're talking about when we hear the word prorations. Owe what is due and yet to be paid. So sometimes the seller hasn't paid the property taxes, for example. They were due in July. Settlement is going to happen in August. So now seller is going to pay July and August, and then the buyer will be responsible for the remainder. Prorations is just a part of the bill. Who's going to be paying for it? Debit to that individual. What are notes that you will remember for yourself when you see a question about credits or debits? It's a credit to whom? It's a debit to whom? Pretty much who's responsible for it? It's a debit Is it the buyer or the seller? Who's responsible for this debt? Credit, who's receiving that money? Is it the buyer or the seller? Is this money that was already paid up front? Therefore, they're receiving it. Or is it money that was already paid for upfront and therefore it's being prorated? Who's receiving that money? That's a credit. Remember again, my dear, focus on that day, that final date when everything is being settled, the settlement date or the closing date. So how will it be divided? We're talking about prorations, who's already paid for it and who's going to be responsible for that money. I love it. You're here already. So let me remind you to subscribe so that you are going to receive notifications of the next videos that we're going to be presenting here in order for you to be successful in passing the Maryland Real Estate Exam. You made it this far, so we're going to review where does this topic fit when you are looking at the PSI Real Estate Exam. It is found in the topic of transfer of title, and you haven't checked out the video that we have about transfer of title. This is an opportunity for you to look into it. It covers the conversation as displayed, which is title insurance, deeds, which is a document that is used to transfer the property. And under this topic, you will see what we just spoke about in closing. What are prorated items? What is a debit? What is a credit? You will definitely probably see it more in the calculations piece. At this point, we leave you with a gift. Pass real estate exam in simple steps. Are you feeling like overwhelmed? I'm sure you are. You've been studying on hours and you're still struggling to pass the National Real Estate Exam. Here's where the PRESS platform has been designed especially for you to take advantage of to make sure that you succeed. What does it entail? It's a platform that you log in. There are a couple of things that are self-paced that you go through at your own time with an extensive library of content on specific topics. Those topics then break it down into a study outline for that topic and also practice questions for those specific topics. It includes a 90-minute monthly exam prep session. Every week for 30 minutes, we shall do a live check-in to review the content and or answer any of the questions you might have. We have also a practice exam that you're able to go through, timed and simulated for you to go through it as if you were taking the exam. All to make sure that you are successful on passing the national part of the exam. What do you get? 3 days for you to check it out for yourself and see whether this is a good fit. When you see it as a good fit, definitely subscribe. You have the option to subscribe on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. The website to visit is thepressplatform.com. All the success. I will see you next time.